All right, so listen to this. You guys send in articles about everything like the German elections, Elon Musk's supposed phone calls, and even some analysis of China trying to maybe make peace in Ukraine.
Yeah, it really is interesting to see how, like, global events all tie together somehow.
For sure. So let's kick things off with Germany. Their recent election saw the Conservative Party win, which, I mean, isn't a huge surprise.
Right.
But what really stood out to me was the far-right AfD party. They, like, doubled their votes and now have something like 20% of the total.
Wow.
It's a pretty big shift to the right, don't you think?
Yeah, definitely something to keep an eye on. It could really shake things up, especially when it comes to, Germany's relationship with the U.S. and how much they support Ukraine.
Oh, that's right, because
Their likely new chancellor, Friedrich Merz, he's been pretty vocal about Europe needing to get stronger and not rely so much on the U.S.
so does that mean we could be seeing some changes across the Atlantic?
It's definitely possible. The thing is, though, replacing the U.S.'s support for Ukraine, like, that's a pretty tall order for Europe.
I can imagine.
Think about it. They'd have to seriously increase their defense spending and maybe even get hundreds of thousands more troops ready to go. It's a huge undertaking.
Wow. Yeah, that makes sense. And it makes you wonder if Europe is actually ready for that, especially with, the AfD gaining so much ground. It seems like a lot of their success has to do with worries about immigration,
Mhm.
specifically the refugees coming from Ukraine, Afghanistan, and Syria. It feels kind of similar to what we've seen in other parts of the world, right?
Oh, absolutely. There are a lot of parallels. But what's particularly concerning about the AfD is their rhetoric.
How so?
Well, they tap into this, like, deeper sense of national identity and anxieties about cultural change. It's a little different, maybe even more volatile, and could make Germany's role on the global stage a lot more complicated.
It's a lot to consider. And speaking of complicated situations, we can't ignore this claim from Alice Weidel, the AfD leader. She's saying that Elon Musk called her to congratulate her on the election results.
Oh, wow.
Is there any truth to that? And if so, what does it even mean?
We'll have to wait and see if that claim can actually be verified. But just imagine the potential connection there.
Yeah.
Musk, with all his global influence, and a party like the AfD, known for its controversial views, it would definitely raise eyebrows.
For sure. It could almost seem like some kind of endorsement.
Right, and that could really change how people see the AfD and maybe even attract more support for them.
And to make things even more interesting, she also praised the U.S. government for focusing on efficiency. She even talked about a ministry of efficiency, something she wants to see in Germany.
Really?
It's almost ironic considering how much they want to distance themselves from the U.S. in other areas.
It's fascinating, right? It suggests they maybe want to take the best parts of different systems. The idea of efficiency, streamlining things in the government that appeals to voters everywhere. And Weidel seems to be tapping into that feeling.
Yeah, definitely something to watch, especially as the AfD gets more powerful. Okay, so we've got this potential power shift brewing in Europe. But this also brings up something else we were talking about before, China's possible role in the Ukraine conflict. We have this analysis from a former Chinese military officer who thinks China might step in as a peacemaker.
Right.
But he has some specific conditions for that to happen, so what's his take?
Well, he lays out 3 potential roles for China, guaranteeing a ceasefire, providing peacekeeping forces, and participating in rebuilding after the war.
Okay.
What I find particularly interesting is his idea of China working together with other global South nations on peacekeeping. They could use their experience and the fact that they have a lot of UN peacekeeping forces already.
That's a pretty bold vision. It makes you wonder, though, is China really ready to take on such a big security role, especially in Europe? That would be a first, right?
It would be a huge shift, but keep in mind this officer also isn't so sure about China's ability to directly force a ceasefire.
Oh, really?
He stresses how important direct talks between Russia and the U.S. are.
So maybe more of a supporting role than a leading one.
Maybe it's like they recognize the limits of their influence, but even taking on a smaller role in peacekeeping would show that they're more willing to get involved in global security matters, and that in itself is a big deal.
And here's where things take a turn. The same officer thinks that U.S.-China relations might actually get better if Trump gets a second term. He points to potential policy changes and the way Trump dealt with China in the past.
Interesting.
Could Trump 2.0 be the answer to improving U.S.-China relations?
It's definitely a bold prediction, especially with all the tension between them right now, but it does make you think.
I know, right?
This officer even suggests that Trump might try to change how people see his approach to China, pushing back against those who want to be more aggressive towards them. The China hawks.
Well,
Maybe a second term would give him the chance to kind of reset things, try a different approach.
a reset, huh? That's a good way to put it. And speaking of resets, we have French President Macron going to the White House to talk about Ukraine. He's trying to convince Trump not to make concessions to Russia. What's the concern there?
Well, Macron seems worried that any concessions would make the U.S. look weak and maybe even embolden China. It's a tricky situation trying to stay united against Russia while also dealing with the complex relationship between the U.S. and China.
And Macron has a history of working with Trump on tough global issues like the Iran nuclear deal and the Paris Climate Agreement. It's a pattern worth noticing, but let's be real, his track record isn't exactly great.
That's true. Those efforts didn't really go as planned. But Macron's persistent, and this time he might have a different angle. He'll probably push for stronger European security guarantees and a boost to NATO defense spending, using France's commitment of 2% of their GDP to defense as an example for others.
So a two-pronged approach asking the U.S. to keep supporting them while also pushing for a stronger European defense. It kind of ties back to our earlier talk about Europe needing to step up. It's like pieces of a puzzle coming together.
Exactly. It's all connected. And this leads us to another crucial piece of the puzzle, the U.S. economy.
Right. We can't forget about all the economic worries brewing. We've got some insights from economists and analysts who are particularly concerned about how tariffs are impacting the housing market and consumer spending.
Yeah, the slowdown in new home construction is definitely a red flag. Rising mortgage rates and people feeling the pinch from inflation are making it tougher and tougher to afford new homes.
It's like a 1-2 punch for anyone looking to buy a house.
Exactly. And this slowdown in new construction could really limit the supply of homes, which could then push prices even higher. It's a situation we need to watch closely because it reminds me of the housing bubble we saw years ago.
Oh, no, that's not good. Is there any big differences this time around, or are we heading for another crash?
It's hard to say for sure, but there are some things that are different. Lending standards are tighter now, which means fewer people are getting mortgages they can't really afford.
That's good at least.
But the combination of those quickly rising interest rates and stubborn inflation is still a big risk. It's a delicate balance.
So we're playing the waiting game, but with caution. And while the housing market is a big piece of the puzzle, what other economic trends are you seeing that could impact our deep dive?
One thing that's really jumped out at me is the change in how consumers are behaving. They're becoming way more price sensitive.
Makes sense. When everything's getting more expensive, you got to be more careful about how you spend your money.
Exactly. We're seeing people put off big purchases, look for deals, and switch to cheaper brands. They're also cutting back on things like eating out or entertainment.
So basically tightening their belts. But what does this mean for the overall economy? Could this shift in consumer spending actually cause a recession?
It's definitely a possibility. Consumer spending is a major driver of economic growth. If people cut back too much, it can have a domino effect leading to slower growth or even an economic contraction. It's something we need to monitor carefully.
It's a lot to process, but before we get totally consumed by economic anxieties, let's shift our focus back to the global stage. We were discussing China's possible role in Ukraine, and it seems like there's some debate about how far they're actually willing to go as a peacemaker.
It's a complicated situation. China has said they want to play a helpful role in resolving the conflict, but they haven't been very willing to condemn Russia's actions. And of course, we can't forget their strong economic ties to Moscow. It's a tricky balancing act.
So are they trying to play both sides, keep a good relationship with Russia while also looking like a neutral peacemaker?
That's definitely a possibility. China often uses strategic ambiguity, avoiding taking a firm stand and maneuvering themselves into good positions. They're masters of the long game.
It's a clever strategy, but it can be frustrating for those who are looking for clear commitments. Have they actually taken any concrete steps towards peace in Ukraine, or is it all just talk?
They've helped facilitate some talks between Ukraine and Russia and provided some humanitarian aid, but those actions haven't been very extensive. It's like they're testing the waters but not ready to fully commit.
Do you think they're waiting to see what happens before they take on a bigger role? Maybe they're weighing the risks and rewards of different actions?
That's a really good point. China is extremely strategic in its foreign policy. They're carefully analyzing the situation, thinking about their own interests, and weighing the potential consequences of their actions. Don't forget they have their own geopolitical ambitions and a complex relationship with both Russia and the United States.
It's like trying to solve a really complicated chess game where every move has unexpected outcomes. But one thing's for sure, China's role in the world is changing, and how they act or don't act in Ukraine will be a big sign of where they're headed in the future.
I couldn't agree more. It's definitely a situation that needs our attention.
Okay, let's take a second to recap what we've covered in this first part of our deep dive. We've talked about the economic worries in the U.S., explored China's possible peacemaking role in Ukraine, and highlighted the general feeling of uncertainty that seems to be hanging over the global landscape.
Yeah, it's a lot to process.
It is, but it shows us something important, how interconnected everything is. What happens in one part of the world can have major effects everywhere else. Understanding those connections is key to navigating the complex world we live in.
I agree.
And as we move into the second part of our deep dive, here's something for you to think about in this world of changing alliances and unpredictable events. How can individuals and nations adapt and succeed? What strategies can we use to handle this new reality? Stay tuned for part 2, where we'll explore these questions and more.
Welcome back to our deep dive into all things global.
We've already covered some pretty heavy stuff, but buckle up because the ride's not over yet.
You're telling me we still need to take a look at some of the key economic trends happening in the U.S., and we all know how much those can affect the whole world.
Right. Okay, so let's talk housing. We've seen some worrying signs lately, especially with new construction. What's behind this slowdown?
Well, rising mortgage rates are definitely playing a big part. I mean, when it costs more to borrow money, buying a home just isn't possible for a lot of people. But it's not just the interest rates. We
Right.
also have to think about the inflation that just won't go away. It's eating away at people's budgets, making them think twice about big purchases like, a new home.
It's a double whammy for anyone who wants to buy.
Exactly. And this slowdown in new construction, that's a real red flag. It can really squeeze the supply of homes, and that could drive prices up even more. It's something we need to keep a close eye on because it feels a little too familiar, like that housing bubble we saw a while back.
Oh, yeah, that's not a good memory. Are there any big differences this time around, or are we heading for another crash?
It's too soon to say for sure, but there are a few things that are different. Lending standards are much stricter now, so not as many people are getting stuck with mortgages they can't afford.
That's good to hear, at least.
But the combo of those rapidly rising interest rates and this stubborn inflation, it's still a big risk. It's a tough situation to be in.
So we're in wait-and-see mode, but with a healthy dose of caution. And while the housing market is a big piece of the puzzle, what other economic trends are you noticing that could affect our deep dive?
One thing that's been really interesting to me is how consumer behavior is changing. People are getting a lot more careful about prices.
Well, yeah, that makes sense. When everything costs more, you got to be smarter about how you spend your money.
Exactly. We're seeing people putting off those big purchases, hunting for bargains and switching to cheaper brands. They're even cutting back on things like going out to eat or entertainment.
Tightening the belt, so to speak. What does this mean for the economy as a whole, though? Could this shift in spending actually trigger a recession?
It's a real possibility. Consumer spending is a huge part of economic growth. If people cut back too much, it can create a domino effect, slowing down growth, or even leading to an economic contraction. It's something we need to pay attention to.
It's a lot to think about, but before we get completely bogged down by all this economic worry, let's switch gears back to the global stage. We were talking about China's potential role in Ukraine, and it seems like there's some disagreement about just how far they're willing to go as peacemakers.
Yeah, it's definitely complex. China said they want to be helpful in finding a solution, but they haven't really condemned what Russia's doing. And of course, we can't ignore the strong economic ties between them. It's a delicate balancing act.
So are they trying to have it both ways, stay friends with Russia while also looking like they're neutral and want peace?
It's definitely possible. China often uses something called strategic ambiguity. Basically, they avoid taking a firm stance and try to position themselves in a way that benefits them. They're really good at playing the long game.
It's a smart strategy, I guess, but it can be frustrating if you're looking for them to really commit to something. Have they actually done anything concrete to help with peace in Ukraine, or is it all just talk?
They've helped with some talks between Ukraine and Russia, and they've provided some humanitarian aid, but those efforts haven't been very big. It's almost like they're dipping their toes in the water but not ready to jump in.
Do you think they're just waiting to see how things shake out before they take on a bigger role? Maybe they're trying to figure out the risks and rewards of different actions?
That's a really good observation. China's incredibly strategic with their foreign policy. They're analyzing everything, considering their own interests, and weighing the potential consequences. Don't forget they have their own goals and a complex relationship with both Russia and the U.S.
It's like a multi-level chess game where every move can have totally unexpected results. But one thing's clear, China's role in the world is changing, and what they do or don't do in Ukraine will tell us a lot about their plans for the future.
Absolutely. It's something we need to keep a close eye on.
Okay, let's take a minute to review what we've talked about in this part of our deep dive. We've delved into the economic worries in the U.S., explored the ins and outs of China's possible peacemaking role in Ukraine, and pointed out this general sense of uncertainty that seems to be everywhere.
Yeah, it's a lot to absorb.
It is, but it really emphasizes how connected everything is. What happens in one part of the world can have massive impacts everywhere else. Getting a grip on these connections is crucial for navigating this complex world we live in.
I totally agree.
And as we head into the last part of our deep dive, here's something to ponder in this world where alliances are shifting and things are unpredictable. How can individuals and husbands adapt and thrive? What can we do to handle this new reality? Stay tuned for part 3, where we'll dig into these questions and more. And we're back for the final stretch of our deep dive, and there's one last crucial piece of this puzzle we need to look at.
You're talking about the whole USAID thing, right? The Trump administration's decision to lay off 2,000 workers and put tons more on paid leave.
Exactly. It's a move that's caused a lot of debate and concern. What could be the impact of these major cuts to USAID?
We have to understand just how important USAID is for delivering foreign aid, promoting development, and responding to humanitarian crises all over the world. These layoffs could really hurt the agency's ability to do its job effectively.
It's not just about the numbers either. These are highly skilled people with years of experience. They have a deep understanding of specific regions and the expertise to tackle really complex development challenges. Losing that kind of knowledge base is a huge blow, don't you think?
Absolutely. It takes time, resources, and dedicated individuals to build that level of institutional knowledge. These layoffs could set back progress on vital development projects, weaken relationships with partner countries, and even undermine the U.S.'s soft power on a global scale. It's like a ripple effect that goes way beyond USAID itself.
And then there's the impact on morale within the agency. Seeing so many colleagues lose their jobs can't be good for motivation or productivity.
That's a good point. It creates this atmosphere of uncertainty and anxiety, which makes it hard for the remaining staff to focus on their work and stay committed. It also kind of sends the message that the administration doesn't really care about foreign aid, which can further demoralize those who are dedicated to this mission.
It's a complicated situation with potential consequences that go beyond just budget cuts. So, what's the reason behind these layoffs? Is it purely a cost-saving measure?
The administration says it's all about efficiency and streamlining. They claim that the agency can do more with less, but critics see it as part of a bigger trend of the U.S. disengaging from global affairs and putting less emphasis on diplomacy and development.
It seems like it comes down to a fundamental difference of opinion about the value and purpose of foreign aid. Some people think it's a waste of taxpayer money, while others see it as an essential tool for promoting global stability and advancing U.S. interests.
You hit the nail on the head. That debate is at the core of this issue. Those who support foreign aid argue that it's a strategic investment that brings real benefits, like preventing conflict, fostering economic growth, fighting poverty and disease, and ultimately creating a more stable and secure world.
And it's not just about being altruistic either. There's a strong national security argument to be made. By tackling the root causes of instability and extremism, foreign aid can help make the world a safer place for everyone, including the U.S.
Exactly. It's often said that development is the best form of defense. By investing in education, healthcare, and economic opportunities in developing countries, we help build more stable and prosperous societies that are less likely to threaten U.S. interests or become breeding grounds for extremism and conflict.
So these USAID layoffs could set up a whole chain of consequences affecting U.S. foreign policy development goals, global security, and even the lives of people who depend on these programs for essential support.
Absolutely. It's a situation where we really need to think about the long-term consequences. The decisions made today will have a big impact on the world of tomorrow.
Well, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, from the changing political scene in Germany and China and a potential role in the Ukraine conflict, to the economic hurdles facing the U.S. and the internal shifts within the Trump administration. It's obvious that we're living in a time of enormous change and uncertainty.
It's a time of both challenges and opportunities. Old ways of thinking are disappearing and new dynamics are emerging. It's more important than ever to stay informed, analyze trends, and have meaningful conversations about the complexities we face and the possible ways forward.
And that's exactly what we aim to do here on the Deep Dive, to give you, our listeners, the knowledge and insights you need to navigate this complex world. So keep those questions coming, and we'll keep digging deeper. Thanks for joining us on this Deep Dive. Until next time, stay curious, stay engaged, and stay informed.